Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to our Hidden Gems of Washington Heights, a virtual walk through the Morris and Jumel properties and nearby. We are back today with our favorite tour guide and Morris-Jumel docent, Alan Cohen. This is his third presentation for us on the new Livestorm model, and always good to have you here, Alan. Remember just a couple of things before I turn it over to Alan. If you are experiencing audio or visual issues with Livestorm, just refresh the page. That will bring you right back in and should solve the problem, hopefully. Also, welcome to all of our insiders. As I always say before all of our presentations, our adored insiders are here for as little as $10 a month. They get unlimited access to all of our virtual programming and our virtual archive. You too could become an insider. If you are not, use the code Join Us when you go to Insiders. The link is in the chat. And also, I know already some of you are saying hello, but Alan has front-loaded this chat with a lot of great articles from Untapped New York that cover some of the topics that he is dealing with today. So please make sure to check those out. As I had put in the chat, one of the other great things is this chat will stay active even after we end the event and when you guys get the replay a couple of minutes after, so you can always access all of those. Alan, I'm going to say hello to a couple of people before I turn it over to you, because I always like to do that. Hello, Robin from the Berkshires. Hello, Jeffrey from Upper West Side. Hello, Richard from Hollywood. Good to see all of you. Lorraine from Asheville. Cynthia from Baltimore. Louise from Washington Heights. Ooh, you've got somebody from Washington Heights. Joe from London. Bertram from Southern California. Gareth, Wales is back. It's good to see you regularly again, Gareth. Sharon from Woodside, Queens, formerly from Washington Heights. Elliot from Las Vegas. Mary from Milwaukee. Christine from Washington Heights. Got a lot of Washington Heights here, people. All right, everybody continue to say hi. I'll catch you in the chat. Alan, I'm turning it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. And if my memory serves correctly, Louise from Washington Heights had either asked an excellent question or made some sort of outstanding comment about the previous Morris-Jumel tour. At any rate, welcome everybody. So just a couple of words of introduction before I launch into the slides. This part of Manhattan that we're going to be visiting was once rural farmland. It was an area of country retreats for the wealthy and later a home to some industries as well. Eventually, it would come to be used as a venue for some sports, which we'll get into a bit, as well as other recreational opportunities. And from its transition from a rural to a suburban to an urban residential neighborhood, it's also been home to some very notable, important people. We're going to be virtually walking along a route near two former uptown estates. The older estate, belonging to retired British Colonel Roger Morris and his American wife, was about 130 acres. Later on, the French emigre Stephen Jumel and his American wife bought an estate with different boundaries of about 140 acres. One notable building has been here since 1765, and that's the Morris-Jumel Mansion, where we're going to end our tour. Justin, you had a question?
Yeah, Alan, one thing which I forgot to cover with you, my bad. At the top right of your screen is a bell button. Do you see it? Of the Livestorm screen. It should be a bell, just a little box with a bell in it. I just want you to hit that button so it mutes your bell. I forgot we had a problem.
I am not seeing that. Is that on my screen or the screen with the slide?
It's on your Livestorm screen. So it's not the screen with the slide. It should be above it. Sorry, everybody.
I'm not seeing.
All right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take down your presentation. I'll put it back up for you. You'll probably see it when I take it down.
Okay.
All right. Do you see it now? A bell button at the top of the screen?
No.
Top right?
I see an X and an expand, 2 arrows to expand the screen, or an X.
And right above that should be, there's no bell?
No.
Okay. All right. Then I will let you proceed. I just wanted you to mute that bell, but I'm not sure why you are not seeing it. Okay. I'll put it back up for you.
All right. And I'm also going to disable my camera. They don't need to see me.
There you go.
We don't need to talk about that further here. We'll get
No.
to it later. Okay. So the Morris-Jumel Mansion is the constant for both the Morris estate and the Jumel estate. And we're going to be ending our tour there. On this home picture, you see a faded image of the mansion. And everything we're going to see on the tour was either on the property of the Morrises or the Jumels, or right nearby and somehow relevant to it. The tour is not chronological, but like any walking tour, I'll talk about what's right in front of us. If I have been confusing or there is an issue that we could conceivably address, direct that issue to Justin, and he will interrupt me, as he did for this bell thing that we couldn't solve. But here we are. Here is an aerial image from Google Earth. And for those of you who are not familiar with the area, just to give you a little bit of orientation, on the right side, we're seeing the Bronx. The current Yankee Stadium is clearly visible at the far right of the screen. And then we have the Harlem River and the High Bridge, which is about the northern end, where the High Bridge is about the northern end of what was the Jumel property. On the left side of your screen, you're seeing the George Washington Bridge. That's about 178th Street or so. That's about 10 blocks north of where the Morris property was. At the south, or the lower part of your screen, the swath of green that you see is Trinity Cemetery. Eliza Jumel's remains are interred there. And the northern end of the cemetery is 155th Street, which was the border of the Morris property. And I point out the Jumel Mansion, which is not located in the middle of all of these estates, but is the constant for both of them. So let's meet the Morrises first, and this is just a very brief overview. I know a number of you took the earlier tour where I went into much more detail. Roger Morris was a colonel in the British Army who fought in North America during the French and Indian Wars. He served alongside, under General Braddock, a British general, but he served alongside Colonel George Washington in the Battle of Wilderness. So George Washington and Morris knew one another. Mary Phillips, who will become his bride, was a very wealthy woman who came to inherit essentially a big chunk of what's now Westchester County and about a third of Putnam County, what's now Putnam County, upstate New York. Mary was rumored to be a love interest of George Washington, but she goes on to marry Roger about a year after Mary and George Washington spent some time together in New York. The married couple of Roger and Mary will have a summer house built on a property that ran river to river, Harlem River to Hudson River. It was about 130 acres. And during the American Revolution in 1776, their mansion was Washington's headquarters for about 5 weeks, mid-September to mid-October 1776. So that gives you just a little bit of a taste of the importance of the mansion, and anything connected with George Washington tends to be preserved, particularly if it was his headquarters for 5 weeks. So now just to introduce the Jumels to you, Eliza Jumel was American, born into extreme poverty in Rhode Island. She moved to New York in her late 20s, where she met the French emigre Stephen Jumel. He was a merchant who was born in Santo Domingo, now Haiti, French roots from Bordeaux, shipping products between France and the US. They bought the Roger Morris house in 1810 and 140 acres, but not river to river. Their property lines were predominantly along the Harlem River side, going up as far north as where the High Bridge is, and only as far south as about 159th Street. Eliza Jumel was the longest living resident in the mansion, not living there all of the time, but she owned the property and was there certainly towards the end of her life continuously, but owned the property 1810 to her death in 1865. And then her family lived in it for a bit longer while her estate was being contested. But when Eliza was in her 50s, she married Aaron Burr in the house. So while that was a short-lived marriage, that sort of added interest and importance to the mansion. But the mansion's not going to be our focus of this tour. And instead, we're going to be following a route. Now, this map at first blush, I think, could be rather confusing. So now with a Google map that I customized, there are three basic outlines to follow. The blue line is a rough approximation of the Morris property, so about 155th to 165th. The green line is an approximation of the Jumel property, the Jumel estate. And again, I say approximations. When the Morrises had their property, streets had not been mapped out. This is way before the grid was even thought about. And if you read about how the property was described, it was things like the fencing after the stone next to the elm tree, that kind of thing. So sort of guessing how accurate this is, but that's what we typically talk about. 155th to 165th, river to river for the Morrises, 159th up to 175th Street for the Jumels. And the red line is our walking route. And obviously a virtual walking route, it probably would be a little bit too far for us. And I'm just pointing out some of the current street names as they exist. And at the lower right-hand corner where the red line begins, that is where I have asked to meet you at the 155th Street BD subway station. And because this is a weekday tour, you could take either of those subways and arrive at that subway station. And we're going to be ending at the Morris-Jumel Mansion, where I'm going to encourage you to go in and take a self-guided tour. So right near our meeting point, right across the street from that, is Rucker Park. And Rucker Park is a public playground with a remarkable legacy. It's named after a now deceased Harlem teacher and playground director for the New York City Parks Department, Holcomb Rucker, who started a basketball tournament in 1950 in order to help less fortunate kids stay off the street and help them to get into college. It became a place, this playground became a home to NBA basketball stars and some of the best high school talent in the country. The game of street ball, it really has a lot of style and finesse. It was not at the time exactly the same kind of thing that was being played by professional basketball players. Street ball was a rougher, a faster version of basketball and usually played outdoors in playgrounds. But some phenomenal players were playing their game. And in fact, at Rucker, one of the things that happened was that high school students like Dr. J wound up playing against professional basketball players, sort of doing this for fun. And some of them realized that the high school players were basically on a par and they're equal. So this was a place that gave an opportunity for very good high school talent to mingle with professional players, but also it influenced ultimately how professional basketball would come to be played, including more aerial acrobatics, and more style than had been seen before. Professional basketball earlier on had been more staid than it came to be. And in addition to Dr. J, there's a long list of basketball legends, but Wilt Chamberlain and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar were others who came to play here. Now, I'm pointing out here where Rucker is towards the bottom of your screen. We see the Harlem River veering off towards the right. And the area, the land, the low ground is referred to as Coogan's Hollow. I'm not sure that anybody really does that today. What you're seeing is a public housing complex, 2 of them, but the taller buildings are part of the Polo Grounds towers. Now, a matter of personal privilege. So I know some of you may be concerned about or talking about, I know Justin was, getting your vaccinations. I got my first and second vaccines at the public facility here at the Polo Grounds Towers. But you have Polo Grounds Towers, that's the lowland. And then Coogan's Bluff is an escarpment. It's a cliff that's about 175 feet above sea level. And I point out where the mansion is. So Polo Grounds Towers is named after, you guessed it, the Polo Grounds, which had been there. So in this image, we're seeing the former Yankee Stadium in the foreground and the Polo Grounds, which does not exist. So both of these buildings have been demolished, and you see the mansion up at the very edge of the photo. So Polo Grounds is really one of the most hallowed ballparks in baseball history. In 1889, the New York Giants baseball team moved uptown to Coogan's Hollow to play in a wooden stadium. After that one burned down, the Giants built a concrete and steel stadium, which opened up in 1911. In 1913, the New York Yankees moved into the ballpark. So that ballpark held both the New York Giants and the New York Yankees. Babe Ruth played there in the Polo Grounds. After the 1922 season, the Yankees, who were tenants, moved into their own ballpark. And I'm sorry, 1922, they were kicked out. Now, by the 1950s, the Giants were struggling to attract fans. Polo Grounds was falling into disrepair. The team moved to San Francisco in 1957. But the Polo Grounds still had some life in it. In addition to being home to baseball teams, it was home to the New York Football Giants, 1925 to 1955, and it was home to the New York Titans, who became the New York Jets from 1960 to 1963, and it housed boxing matches, and one of the most famous was the 1923 heavyweight championship between Jack Dempsey and Louis Firpo. And in this image, now we're on Coogan's Bluff, we're high above, and we're seeing the earlier wooden stadium and no Yankee Stadium yet. So in 1908, this would have been a place where men, you see some women as well, would have stayed, weren't cheap seats, they didn't have any seats, but they had a fairly good view that would have been totally obscured once Polo Grounds became the concrete stadium that it would. But they're standing on Coogan's Bluff, which is just a little bit down the hill from the mansion. Now in this shot, straight above, I drew a red line to indicate what our walking route is going to be. We have gotten uphill, taking some stairs from where both Rucker Park was, the former site of the Polo Grounds. Now we're up at the top, walking south 1 block on St. Nicholas Avenue, and I want to take you to a site that would have been important for Eliza Jumel on 154th, and then you see we're going to walk around the southern edge of Trinity Church and up Broadway to a very busy corner where we'll be for a couple of minutes. So the site that was important to Eliza Jumel, this is at 154th off of what was then 10th Avenue, now Amsterdam Avenue. right next to the lumber yard, that was the first church of the intercession. It was a simple wooden structure, and it was the first purpose-built church for Church of the Intercession, which eventually will become an uptown chapel for Trinity Church downtown. Eliza Jumel was a member of Trinity in Lower Manhattan when she sort of permanently moved uptown to this area. Church of the Intercession was the church that she would have gone to regularly. And that building no longer exists. In the photo that I recently took on the right, you see a ghost of the former building. You see the roof outline against the apartment building that obviously still exists. And actually, Church of the Intercession played an important role in Eliza's life, because towards the end of her life, she changed her beneficiaries to make the Church of the Intercession receive more money than she had originally planned to give her heirs. And that was one of the reasons for them contesting her will and eventually having her will overturned. So now we have made our way onto Amsterdam, and this is what we see today. This is the first of the Audubon bird murals that I'm going to show you, and it's really the most political one. But first, for some context, if you don't know about the project, but the Audubon Bird Mural Project is a collaboration between the National Audubon Society and Avi Gittler, who had an art gallery nearby on Broadway. He now still has a presence in the area, but more of a salon than a gallery that you can enter from street level. The goal of the Audubon project is to display the 314 North American bird species that are threatened with extinction due to climate change or other loss of their natural habitat. More of these get done even during the pandemic. So the numbers are somewhat fluid, but the last I counted, there were 127 bird species represented on 90 different murals. They're in this area to the south as well, but now they're actually even going international, and they're in other parts of the United States. The project began in 2014. This particular piece by an artist known as Gaia calls attention to 3 endangered songbird species, the scarlet tanager, magnolia warbler, tree swallow, and black and white warbler. The mural is the most overtly political one in that it also contains images that refer to the second great migration from the US South. There are also images of even the Dutch coming to Manhattan. And what Gaia is saying is that we seem to be concerned about the threat of habitat for birds, but species as a sanctuary for African Americans is also threatened by gentrification. So we walk around Trinity Church, and this is the Church of the Intercession that exists today. This was constructed well after Eliza was deceased. She had no idea that this was going to go up. She was giving money to an earlier stone structure, a Church of the Intercession, that does not exist either. It was destroyed. But we're at a busy corner. So this is what we're looking at. We're standing on Broadway. We're looking at the Broadway facade. To our right would be Trinity Cemetery on 153rd Street. To our left, 155th Street. And in this image, again from above, we see Audubon Terrace, which is on 155th Street and Broadway. And what we are looking at was at one point like one of the major cultural centers of New York City. Audubon Terrace here, also known as the Audubon Terrace Historic District, is a landmark complex of early 20th century Beaux-Arts buildings. It was commissioned in 1907 by Archer Huntington, who was the heir to railroad fortune. He was a philanthropist and also a Spanish scholar. And in 1904, he founded the Hispanic Society of America, which is housed here. So in part, he had this complex built to further understanding of Hispanic culture, even religion in North America in this particular area. Other institutions that have been here, not necessarily here today, but some continue. The American Numismatic Society, the American Geographical Society, the Spanish-speaking Church of Our Lady of Esperanza, the Museum of the American Indian, or the Hay Collection, which moved to Washington, D.C., and a smaller part of its collection is at the tip of Broadway, the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. The architects here are McKim, Mead, and White, and so they're well known for doing other buildings as well. They added on the American Academy of Arts and Letters, which is still here, but now, in addition to the Hispanic Society and Arts and Letters, the major tenant is the bilingual Boricua College. They're the major tenant of the complex. But in the center of the complex, we see a sculpture court. And here we see that group is done by Anna Hyatt Huntington, who I think is pretty well recognized as being one of the major American sculptors and one who tends not to get her due. So you get a little bit of a sense of what she's done here. And I particularly want to call attention to something that contemporaries may not feel needs to be mentioned, but to really put her in a context. Not only was it rare for a woman of her day to be a highly recognized sculptor, but to do equestrian statues was almost unheard of. These large pieces were viewed as something that women were not likely able to do, but she certainly proved that wrong, not only with the sculpture of El Cid that's here, but also you may have seen Joan of Arc along Riverside Drive in Manhattan, or at the southern end of Central Park, the statue of Jose Marti is another one of her equestrian statues. And she is somebody who started young, and this is something that blew me away. This is a sculpture she did of her sister, who was also an artist, and she did this sculpture at the age of 16. So I'm not sure what art. You may be some gifted artists out there, but I think a lot of people are really still struggling to come into their own at the age of 16. I find it quite remarkable. So Audubon Historic District, what's that on? Well, it's on the property of John James Audubon, whose name graces a number of features in this area. Now, to be clear, John James Audubon was a neighbor of, was a contemporary of Eliza Jumel. So they overlapped in time. And my understanding from some historians that know a lot about John James Audubon, while they would have known one another, Audubon's wife would have known Eliza Jumel, they were not friends. There were certainly similarities in their stories, but enough differences that I think the Audubons wanted nothing to do with Eliza. In 1842, Audubon moved his family into a house just north of 155th Street, originally on 14 acres of farmland that he had bought. They expand the property a bit. Audubon's sons called their mother Minnie, and then they began calling the working farm Minnie's Land. Now, Audubon was a man of many identities. He was an artist, a naturalist, a woodsman, an adventurer, and like Eliza Jumel, a myth maker. So part of what he did was create his own story. And while we recognize him as a champion of birds and the natural environment, and he's had an enduring legacy, he also was not going to promote some of the things he didn't want us to know, like he was born out of wedlock. And that was something that Eliza Jumel was familiar with in her family. His father was the owner of a sugar plantation in Haiti, but James knew his father, and his father actually saw to it that James was well cared for. But his mother was a chambermaid, a mistress of his father. The Audubon Society actually is trying to acknowledge the less desirable or less published aspects of Audubon's past, in that he was a slave owner who wasn't merely going along with what was done at the times, but he wrote against and spoke against the abolition movement. He also failed to give Native Americans and also enslaved people who worked with him or for him credit for their discoveries, essentially taking them as his own. Audubon expanded his farm to about 20 acres, but by the 1860s, the property passed out of family hands and it began to be developed into mini estates and housing with land. It was suburban. We really didn't have mass transit yet, but it was becoming suburban. You could go south perhaps to 125th Street and get on a trolley, take a dirt road, take transportation on the river. The train on the riverside would have worked at this point, so that was an option to commute, but it was suburban. And the house really lasted until 1917. There was a movement to keep it alive, to create a house museum. It was moved, but it wound up being vandalized and never got preserved. None of it remains. Now, we're still at this corner of Broadway and 155th, and here we see our second Audubon mural, Fish Crow, by the artist Hitness. And as is true for most, but not all, of the artists who have been chosen to do these murals, Hitness, who was a Roman, was a graffiti creator, shifted into large-scale murals, and then in 2015 traveled through the United States following the route that John James Audubon took and painted 15 murals in other states. He's a teacher, an art teacher at Rome's European Institute of Design. Now, one thing I'd like to call attention to, you don't really see it with these large-scale images that the public can touch, but in addition to the actual birds being threatened, the murals themselves are threatened. Many are painted on storefront security gates, and some of the older ones dating back to 2014 or 2015 are rusting. Sometimes buildings have been sold and the new owners don't want the murals or remove them when they're renovating the property. This particular mural is over a gas station, and there were murals painted, smaller ones, on the windows of the garage bay doors that opened and closed. There were about a dozen or so, and many of them really interesting. But a lot of people came to this area to look at the murals and would be standing right in front of the gas pumps or in the way of vehicles. So I don't know if it was as a safety issue or they were just tired of dealing with the tourists, but those specific murals on the garage bay doors have been removed. But this one exists, and then cat-a-corner to that, we have this mural, which still exists, Swallow-tailed Kite and Others, in which the artist known as Lunar New Year depicts 12 other endangered birds, and you can see a number of them are embedded in the body and the wings of this kite. He is a Latinx artist. Lenny Correa is his actual name. He's a muralist and organizer, born in Ecuador, but now based out of New Jersey. And just so that you know, sometimes the artists go for realism, which obviously this isn't, although just kind of get into your head the head of the bird and also what the bird is doing. Some of them are realistic, some of them are very fanciful, some of them are abstract. They are not obligated to do a faithful rendition of the bird, but some choose to. But here is Lunar New Year's inspiration for this particular bird is Audubon's. So you see that there's a lot of realism that went into it, although he placed so many other birds in the wings and the body of this swallow-tailed kite. So from where we are now, so we're still at the lower end of the red line. You see Trinity Cemetery. What I'm going to do is take you off of Broadway to something that became of um, recent interest to me. And if you've been following the news, it may have called your attention. There's a property at 857 Riverside Drive that I'm going to take you to. But then we're going to come back to Broadway and look at a landmarked facade on 161st Street, and then continue up to St. Nicholas Avenue. I'll point out where we're going as we move along, but just a little bit of a preview. So here we are looking at 857 Riverside Drive. The photo on the left, one of the last, if not the last, taken by Berenice Abbott, is of a house that was built in 1851. So this would have also overlapped with the time that Eliza Jumel was alive. I'm not sure. The owner may have known Eliza, but the building was erected for a Dennis Harris, who was an abolitionist. So on Audubon's property, a slaveholder and anti-abolitionist, Dennis Harris, built this house. And there's been a local community group that has been advocating for its preservation. They had applied to the Landmarks Preservation Committee to have the building preserved. You see what it looks like today, the image on the right side, and they were denied. So much of the building had been altered, taken down, like the cupola on top, a lot of the gingerbread, the front porch, the side as well. They just didn't see it as worthy of landmarking. And this particular local group is really trying to draw attention to the property. Not only was he an abolitionist, the part that they can't prove is that it may have been one of the stations on the Underground Railroad. One of the things that this house also speaks to is this is like a half a block above the highway. We're technically on Riverside Drive, where the highway is also called Riverside Drive, but that's Riverside Drive West. There had been a sugar factory there, and so along the river's edge, there had been a number of industries, and he owned that sugar factory, sugar refinery. So I think the hope of the community group was that they could call attention to the abolition movement in northern Manhattan, of which there is very little evidence, as well as its industrial past, and have a house museum. But they have been struggling to get enough support to, really change the Landmarks Commission's viewpoint. Now we make our way over to Broadway. And here is a confession of my own ignorance. I'm not sure exactly when I learned this, but I think I was living in Washington Heights, where I lived for about 3 years. So this is going back about 10 years, walking around and really fascinated by a couple of properties that we're going to come to. And I saw that the street signs, like we see on the left, it says Juan Rodriguez Way. And I figured, okay, Juan Rodriguez, probably a Dominican. Was he like the president of the Dominican Republic? And to, I guess, my shame, what I learned was that he is, or was, the very first non-native to settle in what would become New York City. He had an African mother and a Portuguese father. They were living in the Spanish settlement of Santo Domingo, which is now the Dominican Republic. Jan, as he might have been known, or Juan, was hired by a Dutch sea captain, and he served as a translator on trading voyages to the Native American island called Manhattan. And some of the people under the Dutch really were, linguists. So he had Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, and he was able to quickly pick up the Algonquin language of the Lenape people. We're talking about 1613. So he was dropped off with some goods to trade and he established trade with the natives, and Dutch ships would come back periodically to get the goods like pelts or lumber that the natives were providing, and the natives would get things like hatchets or knives or muskets. Historical evidence does suggest that Juan Rodriguez was living in the city. He had married a native, that he was living here at least into the 1640s, but we don't really know what happens to him after that. So to me, it's rather amusing. We have so much attention to Henry Hudson, who sets, sight, and the early white Dutch settlers. But the first person to really, non-native, to really live in Manhattan could be called a Dominican and a person of color. The two images that you're seeing, neither of them are in the area where we're walking. It's just that street sign. But the larger one is a detail from a mural that's along the Harlem River. And the painting on the right is part of a larger work that's in the Schönberg Library. So we're on 161st Street, and we come to this landmarked facade of a firehouse. And, these kinds of Beaux-Arts structures, they usually, speak about the City Beautiful movement. What I had to really think about when I was reading the Landmark Commission report is that this was a time when the neighborhood was transitioning and really becoming heavily urbanized and needed municipal facilities like firehouses. So, it really is a spanking brand new neighborhood. The subway station uptown here opens up in 1906. It hadn't gone this far. It only went up to 145th Street, 1904. And so it makes its way up here in 1906. So the area is really being built up, and it really is making a statement, I think, of what the city government felt the neighborhood was worthy of at the time. And also, it's not that long after consolidation when we've become Greater New York and really talking about what an important city we are. We're back to the route map, and what I'm pointing out now is that we're going to be going north on St. Nicholas Avenue, coming to the Dinosaur Elm that we'll see, then back onto Broadway, where we're going to go north for a good bit up until 173rd Street. So the Dinosaur Elm at St. Nicholas and 163rd is seen to be at least 300 years old, and that this would have been here when George Washington had his headquarters at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. Legend has it, I underline legend, that Washington stood under this tree and was looking at Manhattan, the city burning, the tip of Manhattan, September 23rd, I think it was, of 1776. I'm questioning that because the mansion itself would have provided a much better place to look at that. He could have gone to the Widow's Walk on the second floor and really had a better view with a spyglass. But that's what local legend has it as. Now, we often talk about preserving facades or buildings themselves, or sort of much more rarely interiors of buildings. But there's concern that how can we preserve ancient trees like this, of which there are only a handful that predate the city, predate America as we know it. And that is by taking the tree's DNA and trying to grow new trees from the actual DNA. And that's happening to this particular tree. So here we come to the next Audubon bird, but this is the very first time, I hope it's not the last, that a mosaic was created. This is at 163rd Street and Broadway. So this is really much smaller. This is just at the side of a pharmacy at 163rd. And you see the artists Carlos Pinto and John Sear. All of those mosaic tiles are repurposed materials. So I can't point them out to you, but above the swan, there's this swirl right above its left wing, a swirl of yellow. And above that, there's this white line that's outlined in black. Those are dominoes. And so in addition to being repurposed materials, it's really an homage to the street scene in Washington Heights of the men typically, sometimes women, but men typically playing dominoes on the street. We go up, this is 163rd. We walk up to 164th and Broadway, the other side of the street. We're seeing The Greater Sage Grouse by George Barugi. And I'll just read you the artist statement. I wanted to depict this bird as bold and confrontational and holding us accountable. It does. So it would be easy to overlook some of the murals, but this one sort of speaks to you. It demands, I want to be seen. Now, here we come to one of the things that drew me to this area was the story of this building, which has been known by different names, Audubon Ballroom, the Shabazz Center. This really was about preservation, who has what rights. It was originally constructed in 1912 for the Hungarian immigrant William Fox, creator of 20th Century Fox. It had a 2,500 seat theater and a ballroom for 200 guests on the second floor. The theater first functioned as a vaudeville house, later a movie theater, where they would play the first talkie in the area. In the 1930s, a Jewish congregation began meeting in the basement. Unions met in meeting rooms here, the municipal transit workers, think Mike Twill and the Transport Workers Union. In the 1950s, as the neighborhood morphs, the ballroom became an important landmark for the African American community. 1964, after Malcolm X returned from a pilgrimage to Mecca, he formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which began to hold weekly meetings here. And in this image, you see some of the lovely terracotta work. On the left, what I'm just showing you is the Fox, which is an homage to William Fox, who had the building created. And the other terracotta is, the boat and Neptune and the maiden, really just wonderful, really restored. But here we see, and I apologize that I know it's not totally sharp, so sometimes it hurts the eyes to look at this, but here it is as a theater, and you can see on the right side where the seating for the theater would be. And it really, will change over time from being vaudeville house to movie theater. By the 1960s and 70s, again, with the neighborhood changing, it was the San Juan Theater showing Spanish language movies, and it was a landmark for the Latinx community. It officially closed to the public in 1980. And it wound up being in the building just sat and it deteriorated over time. It had not been landmarked. In 1989, Columbia University purchased the property. They had agreement from the city to demolish the ballroom, and they were going to put up a medical research facility. The Black community, preservationists, even Columbia students protested the demolition. The eventual compromise was to protect 2/3 of the facade of the building and a portion of the interior ballroom. And the complex now serves as the Audubon Business and Technology Center, and the university restored the Broadway portion of the facade. This Malcolm X statue is in the lobby. It's a life-size statue. He was shot to death on the stage of the ballroom when delivering a speech in 1965. In 2005, the Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center opened in the lobby. And then also on the second floor, they have space to tell Malcolm X's story. Now, here, we're going to see a little bit more of it later on. As we walk north from this property, we come to the Washington Heights and Inwood World War I Memorial. The artist here is Grace Vanderbilt Whitney, who we probably know better as the founder of the Whitney Museum, but she was an artist in her own right and did a lot of memorial work. This is situated in John Poroy Mitchell Square, who at 34 was the youngest mayor of the city of Greater New York. And here we see in this aerial shot, when you look down below, the main reason for showing you this image is of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. But in the lower part of the image, you're seeing the Audubon Ballroom, and you clearly see where the research facility is. You see what was preserved, where those cars are parked had all been theater space. And at one point, actually, there was even a car dealership in the building before it was demolished. At any rate, the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital moved up here to 168th Street, 1928. New York Hospital and Presbyterian Hospital merged to create the largest, most comprehensive hospital in New York, over 13,000 employees and 2,200 patient beds. And then what we're doing now is continuing north. On the far left, just almost off of the image, is Columbia Presbyterian, but we're going to be walking straight up on St. Nicholas to 173rd Street. And when we make a right, going towards Amsterdam Avenue, we're going to be walking towards the High Bridge Recreational Complex and we see the pool in this particular image. Now here, if we got inside the complex, you wouldn't see it from the street level, although you'll see the tower. You're seeing the High Bridge Water Tower, which was completed in 1872, and the Pool and Recreation Center completed in 1936. So what's important here is this had been Jumel property, so either seized or purchased through negotiation. In bits and pieces, the Croton Aqueduct would come into Manhattan in what had been Jumel property, and the actual aqueduct running south through Jumel property to get onto Amsterdam Avenue, where it would have been off of their property, and then proceed south into Central Park and obviously also to like Fifth Avenue, 42nd Street. But that Croton Aqueduct system was expanded and altered over time, doing things to increase capacity, like building the water tower, which was used to help regulate water pressure. So that comes much after the original aqueduct was constructed. And here, in two different images, the artist's rendering that we have on the left is showing the High Bridge that's about 138 feet above the Harlem River. And in this painting, you see that the river doesn't have a lot of water in it, because just to the south, the McCombs Dam Bridge, McCombs Dam, the river was actually dammed so that they could use water power, for sawmill and that kind of thing. And in the image on the right, you're seeing a reservoir that was constructed. So that wasn't one of the original things that was built, but built between 1866 and 1872, and then went offline in 1834 when the rec center was built essentially on that footprint. Now, the High Bridge itself, which was only a pedestrian bridge constructed to get water over, it never had vehicular traffic of any kind, but allowed pedestrian traffic. That became a tourist attraction, as did something else that I'll show you in just a minute. But north of the property, there were even amusement parks built. And so the Fort George Amusement Park, now this is up 190th Street, so this is a mile and a half north, but just giving you a sense that this was really a major area for recreation. And it was called a trolley park because you could take trolleys up Amsterdam, and Amsterdam ran through or alongside the properties that I'm telling you about. And again, there's a nice article in the chat that you can look to for more information about this lost amusement park, and I think others as well. If it's not on that link, Untapped has other articles about the lost amusement parks of the city. But what was the other major amusement? And that was the Harlem River Speedway, which most definitely was on Jumel property, and before that, the Morrises as well. Now, part of it was built. They shaved off some of the rock from the escarpment to help create the roadbed, and I think there's some landfill as well. But the Harlem River Speedway, which opened up in 1898 and lasted until 1919, was an amenity for wealthy people to race and for the rest of us to watch them. Also, we could watch boat races in the river. But there were a couple of things that you could do if you wanted an outing. Instead of going to Coney Island, you could come watch activity on the Speedway, be well over the Harlem River on the bridge, or go to an amusement park. And there were numerous restaurants that were built in this area as well to attract tourists. Now here, what we're seeing is that the river will wind up being expanded, and in order to make it more navigable, the decision was made in the 1920s to remove a number of those sections. Those beautiful sections were lost. So this was 1928. So a single 450-foot long steel arch was put in. What had been the Harlem River Speedway will, when it's opened up for cars, become the Harlem River Driveway, and today it's the Harlem River Drive. But when we're looking on the right, from the point where the bridge comes into Manhattan and all of that greenery, which is the High Bridge Park going south, most of that, which is cliffside, was in the property of the Jumels. Now, what we're going to be doing is walking south on Amsterdam Avenue and then veering off onto Audubon for a bit. I want to show you a facade. We're going to come to Word Up Bookstore and then get very close towards the last bits of the tour. So I found this fascinating when I was learning about Manhattanville and actually preparing a tour for Manhattanville that's not on our right at all, and talking about Sheffield Farms Dairy, which existed. In the image that you see on the left, that is the original Sheffield Farms dairy stables where their horses were kept. It was at Broadway at 130th Street. Now it's the Jerome Green Science Center. It's one of the modern buildings. Columbia owned that property, still does. And this facade was a nationally registered landmark because of its connection to both the architecture, but the history of Sheffield Farms and the dairy industry in Manhattanville. So Columbia had the facade removed, and you see it on the right where it is now at 51 Audubon Avenue. And there's a plaque that tells you what it had been, but it's merely used as a facade for a medical office building. And the only reason it's there is Columbia owns the property. And it's just a lovely facade that got repurposed and put somewhere else. So I'm glad it was preserved. We go south and we come to Word Up Books, which is a community-run, not-for-profit bookstore, an art space. Very recently, they've been doing COVID-19 tests there to people, but you also see 2 more murals of endangered birds. And if these look like they were done by youth, it's because they were. Community groups of students of different ages who were supervised by a Dominican graphic artist. And the birds here are the Henslow sparrow and which is the other one, the mountain bluebird. Now we're coming into the home stretch, and one of my favorite Audubon bird murals we're going to see on 163rd Street. That's the tricolored heron. I noted where the dinosaur elm is just to give you a sense of where we had been earlier in the tour. And I'm going to be taking you down Edgecombe Avenue to 162nd Street, where we'll get on Jumel Terrace. We're going to see Sylvan Terrace, but we're going to be looking at it from St. Nicholas Avenue on the left. So I monkeyed with the viewpoint just because I thought it was a prettier photo. We will walk past the entrance to the Morris-Jumel Mansion because I'm taking you to 160th Street, where I want to point out a plaque that's right off of our route, and also talk about 555 Edgecombe before we double back to the Morris-Jumel Mansion. So here we are at Tricolored Heron, which was one of the things that drew me to this neighborhood, by the artist Iana Cruz. Iana Cruz is how he's known. His name is Federico Massa. He's university trained from Milan, now lives in Brooklyn. And he developed a signature style of using spray paint, stencil, and brushwork, and works in various textures. So I love this one. And now what's happening is that we're on Jumel Terrace. Actually, where that tree is where we're walking. But this view where we see the mansion in the background is of Sylvan Terrace, which had been the carriage drive to the mansion. It was constructed in 1882, housing for middle-class workers, and I think the largest row of wooden houses in Manhattan. That plaque that I mentioned to you had me curious. It's on the side of one of the row houses. What was the Silston Library? Where was it? And what I learned was that it was actually in the Caribbean, St. John's in Antigua. The founder was a man named Clement Silston, who was born in Antigua, came to the United States to study theology, and was amazed to find that we had public libraries here, and they were not in his country, and he wanted to establish one. So he used that brownstone as an office where he raised money and sent books to his homeland. This two-story structure in Antigua was built, but it hasn't received continuing support. I don't know if it still exists. Now, right across the street from the mansion is sometimes known as Triple Nickel 555 Edgecombe. Roger Morris Apartments, also known as the Paul Robeson Residence. And its residents, a lot of everyday people who do wonderful things, but there have been some very significant American figures who've lived here. Paul Robeson, I won't go into all of what he did, but his father was an escaped enslaved person. Robeson was a scholar athlete. He was an all-American football player. He was class valedictorian at Rutgers University. He received his law degree from Columbia University while playing professional football on weekends to pay for tuition. So he sang, he got involved with the Harlem Renaissance between 1925 and 1961, heavily recorded. He established himself as a concert artist, theater artist, film star. Over the years, he grew more and more politically active, more and more committed to civil rights. And this was something I recently learned, which I found tarnished my image of President Truman. In 1946, he confronted President Truman to establish federal anti-lynching laws. But Truman told him that the time wasn't right and he wasn't going to support that. But Robeson became more assertive. His increasing assertion got him investigated by the FBI, and he was one of the people to be grilled by Senator Joseph McCarthy. He lived in Harlem from 1950 to 1955. In the same building, Lena Horne was a singer, actress, and civil rights activist, one of the top African-American performers of her time, movies. What was different for people like her at the time? She refused to play roles that stereotyped African-American women. Now, another person that refused stereotyping was Canada Lee, who is incredible to me. He's multi-talented and also did not have an easy life. He was a musical prodigy. He was playing concerts at the age of 12. He became a successful jockey, a horse trainer. He became an amateur, then a professional boxer. He was really just struggling to make a living. He, as a boxer, lobbied for health insurance and health care and retirement homes for fighters. As an actor, he was discovered by Orson Welles and appeared in several plays with Welles as director. His most famous film role was in Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat, depicted here in 1944. There seems to be an assumption that this may have been the first major Hollywood movie in which a Black character was not treated as a stereotype. And this was as a result of Lee's insistence. He changed the dialogue, which originally was written to be in Step and Fetch It style, and he would have spoken like just any other normal human being. He was labeled subversive by the 1940s, blacklisted, and died impoverished at age 45, but he paved the way for future generations. Major musical figures lived in the building. So Ellington was a great jazz composer, band leader, composed classical suites, thousands of scores. Ellington, unlike others that I've spoken about, grew up with a secure middle-class family who had supported him in studying piano. Basie helped establish jazz as a serious art form, not just in clubs or in theaters, but also concert halls, and helped to establish one of jazz's predominant styles, linking jazz and the blues. Now, some may know, but others not, that the saxophone was invented as a classical music instrument in the 1840s, and that though some jazz musicians really used it as a jazz instrument, it's going to be Hawkins who really solidifies the saxophone as one of the major jazz instruments. In addition to musicians and actors and singers, Joe Louis was a resident of the building. He was the second longest reigning heavyweight champion in world boxing. His first professional loss was in 1936. His reign was 1937 to 1949. He lost at the hands of Max Schmeling, the German boxer, and then met Schmeling again in 1938 for a rematch that American media portrayed as a battle between Nazism and democracy. One of the odd things was Max Schmeling was not a Nazi. There's stories about him at the end of the tour. If you want to know, I'll tell you an interesting thing about Schmeling. Louis knocks out Schmeling. That made him a national hero. And some critics, historians feel that he may have been the first Black American to be widely admired by whites. Again, this was at a time of Jim Crow. But the fact he was representing the country against Nazism, and he defeated Schmeling, much to the dismay of Adolf Hitler. In addition, we wound up, and I'm a retired psychologist, so these were people, particularly Kenneth Clark, who were known to me. I learned about Mamie, which says something about women's history, or the lack thereof. Their work influenced the experiments that documented the negative effects of segregation on African American children. And they were the first Blacks to obtain their doctoral degrees in psychology from Columbia University. Kenneth Clark was the first Black tenured full professor at the City College of New York, the first Black to be president of the American Psychological Association, and the first Black appointed to the New York State Board of Regents. And they were folks, or at least Kenneth was, who testified in front of the Supreme Court, or it was their experiments that were presented for the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case in 1954. One important person, well, there are a number of important people, but one fairly famous New Yorker who still lives in that building is Marjorie Elliott. She's a living legend. Since 1992, except for COVID, she has been giving free jazz concerts in her parlor in 555, rain or shine, all year long, and she has been providing jazz concerts free on the front terrace at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. So did not happen for COVID, but the mansion has planned a concert series with her again for this coming August that would be outside. And in the last slide that I'm going to show you, this is one of hers, and that takes us to the mansion with her right in front. And with that, I've gone over a bit. I apologize. We were thumping around with the difficulty. Let me get myself back on camera and answer any questions that you might have.
Alan, thank you as always. Enjoyable, thorough. I always learn something on one of your tours too. And also for those of you who did not join us for Alan's Morris-Jumel Mansion tour, if you're an insider, that is in the archives, and a really awesome tour as well. So, and designed to sort of pick up from here. So let's get to some questions, Alan. Let you get a sip of water. I'm going to start from the bottom and go up. Lorraine DePaldi's asked, was that Co-op City next to the Polo Grounds?
No, it's Wrangell Houses. It's not, it's Charlie Wrangell's brother, but it's not the first name. So earlier public houses, but that's not the Bronx, that's Manhattan.
Got it. Pete Tannen asks, why is there overlap between the Jumel and Morris properties? I assume that they owned it at different times.
They did. What happened to the Morris is that they were loyalists and they chose the wrong side of history. So their property was all seized from them, and the governments, particularly New York government, sold off the property, and it was no longer the same configuration. So you needed to assemble an estate in bits and pieces. It wasn't sold as one lot as the Morrises had it. And the Jumels were buying property from different owners, the constant being the house, being the mansion. I hope that's clear.
Yep. Good. Richard Roth asked, who was the architect of the Fox building?
Oh, he did all the other Wonder Theaters. My memory is going to escape me for a minute. So he does United Palace Theater. He does Lamb, Thomas Lamb, who does many of the vaudeville houses and early theaters. That was him. Is that name ringing a bell to you, Justin?
Yes, I couldn't get it either, but when you said Lamb, because I've been to United a couple times actually.
Right.
Did he do Kings?
I believe so.
I think he did Kings as well. Yes, which is, I mean, if you haven't seen King, I mean, United is beautiful, but the King's Theater is just off the chain after the restoration. It's amazing. Pete also asked, what was the 3 to 4 story building just to the north of the Manhattan side of the High Bridge?
Oh, I don't know its function. It's depicted in multiple paintings. I don't know what it was.
Okay, and I don't know. I'm trying to remember what the building was, but I don't know either.
It looks utilitarian, but yeah. I have not seen it identified.
All right, Pete. This is a mystery that either Alan or I will have to crack, because I'm going to do some High Bridge stuff next month, so I'll I'll get on it. Pete asked, since the Harlem River is tidal, how did Macomb Dam impound water? Macomb's Dam, sorry, impound water to run a mill.
I'm not sure I got the first part of the question.
Yeah, sorry, because I screwed that up. My fault. Since the Harlem River is tidal, how did Macomb's Dam impound water to run a mill?
I think that's an engineering question that I can't answer.
Okay. I'm trying to think.
So you have a structure at water level that's going riverbank to riverbank.
Right.
And I'm not sure if a wheel, the water is moving a wheel. Is it able to go in either direction? I don't know from an engineering perspective.
I'm thinking it would have to, but again, I'm not an engineer either. So this is
2 questions, 2 stumpers.
I know. Well, Pete's always good for that. Pete
asks me questions.
Pete always asks the best question. Thank you, Pete. Ken Goody asked, do you have information on the German-American beer gardens that were on Edgecombe in Amsterdam between the upper 160s and 170s, where High Bridge Park is now?
No.
Ken, I will be doing a presentation. Actually, I'm going to be doing a live walk from Highbridge Park over Highbridge middle to end of May for insiders. So I will. I'm doing my research right now, so I will look that through and see. Robert Morbo, Morbo, as he's affectionately known to me. Could it be that it wasn't titled yet? I think it's always referring to the Harlem River. I believe the Harlem River has always been titled, hasn't it?
My understanding.
Yeah. This is a good question. I'm ruminating on this, which I shouldn't, because it's blocking me from asking the questions. All right, I'm going to go back over to the chat to John C. Rumley, perhaps, I hope I pronounced that right, said the building is a pump house. That would make sense. So I'm assuming that is the 3 to 4 story building by Highbridge, and that's what he says. Joseph Rosenberg said the architect for Kings were 2 brothers, Rap and Rap. Ah, right. Thank you, Joseph. That is right. Pete just said, I just looked it up online, and Wikipedia states that McCombs Dam, I keep saying that wrong, sorry. McCombs Dam would hold water for a tide-powered grist mill. So I guess that the difference in tides powered the mill. Oh, interesting. That is interesting. Will that be an in-person walk? It will be, Nancy. So it's going to be in person, and hopefully I will be getting somebody to live stream it, because I can't live stream and lead and have you guys there in person. So I'm going to ask either Aaron or somebody to film us so that everybody gets to do it. And I believe it's the 3rd weekend in May. But we'll be all of the in-person insiders experiences are going up within a week or 2, so they're all going to be released at the same time. Morbo says, I know things were a lot different up there waterway-wise. Well, yeah, after they blew out Hellgate and everything, but I think it's always been titled. I could be completely wrong, but I think Harlem River has always been. Lorraine says, great presentation, so much information and so much to see. Can't wait to travel again. Yes, we're getting there. Will this be available as a recording? Yes, John. John, I'm not sure if you're an insider. It will be in our archives, but you will get a replay of this sent directly to your inbox. Since you joined us today, it will show up about 4 to 5 minutes after I have ended the event. And you'll be able to access it to watch it again.
Justin, what just occurred to me was that in the early history of the area, there would not have been as much water. Now, while the Long Island Sound would have connected to the East River, the Harlem River would have had much less water because the ship canal was put in more late 19th century, early 20th century around the tip of Manhattan. That was not a navigable waterway by boats.
Oh.
They opened that up. There was always water, but that was when Manhattan, as we know, part of the Bronx, Manhattan is now in the Bronx, Marble Hill. That got cut through, severed with the ship canal going in, and off the top of my head, I'm not going to remember the years, but that would have clearly been something you could have walked from Manhattan to the Bronx. You would have got feet wet, but not after they put the ship canal in. Right. Yes, that makes sense. I didn't, you know what? And as Robert Morbeck just said, I tried to tell you, just kidding. That's right. I didn't realize in my mind's eye, I was going out to the east in Connecticut, not to the west and further north around what I call the panhandle of Manhattan. But yeah, no, that was before they put that in. Sometimes you could, like you said, low tide, you could walk right across it. Right. Marble Hill, 212. That's a great neighborhood. That would be a good presentation. Pete Tannen says, thanks for a fascinating, quite varied presentation, including some little known sites. Here. I agree. Thank you very much. If there are no further questions for Alan, let me see. No, it doesn't look like there are in the questions tab. I'm here back at the chat.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Alan, as always, for a very wonderful and, as I always say, thorough. We always get a very thorough job from Alan. Alan, what's next on the tap? Did we have we picked our next tour?
No, we were talking about maybe a walk from between the two Columbia campuses, Manhattanville focus, but we didn't finalize anything.
Okay. Yeah, Manhattanville would be great. All right, well, let's talk about it. Alan will definitely be back with us this week. We have a good packed week for you. Tomorrow, I am with you at noon for The Secrets of New York. What we are doing is we have our very well received article of 160 Secrets of New York. I am highlighting 15. I keep thinking of this as like a concert, so there will be some greatest hits, and there will also be some new ones that we haven't talked about yet in presentation form, so I hope you join us. That is at noon tomorrow, and let me get that link up, because I promised Nicole, since she is not here, that I would put the links up for you. If anybody's interested in attending, again, it's noon tomorrow. Then on Thursday, we are going interstellar. Fred Flancer is joining us for a talk about Mars. He's got some, we actually just previewed it. It's really great. There's some animations in there. He's got some videos and some footage directly from Perseverance and the Mars rovers that are up there. That is going to be quite fun. I know not New York related, but pretty cool. And I'm putting the link up to that as well in the chat right now. So, and then next week we're going to the Borscht Belt. So next Tuesday, we're going to the abandoned Borscht Belt, and I'll put that link as well. And that is it. So hopefully I will see you guys tomorrow. Tomorrow it will be me. And that is what we got. Sorry, I'm like chewing gum and walking at the same time here by getting these links. That's why it's so much better when Nicole does it. Thank you, Alan, so much for this presentation and for your time. It is a beautiful afternoon in New York. I hope everybody can, if you're in the tri-state area, go out and enjoy some of it, including you, Alan. And that will be it. Again, this will be made, the recording will be sent to you in a couple of minutes if you'd like to watch it again. Alan, any final thoughts before we sign off?
Thank you all for joining me.
All right. There it is. Have a good day, guys. Please stay safe, and hope to see you again this week. Bye.
Bye now.